Hello everybody, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I am playing some Phantom Doctrine, a Cold War spy thriller game, much in the vein of XCOM or Jagged Alliance to some extent. It came out a couple of weeks back, and it did a first impressions video. It kind of had some mixed reviews, if you will. The game it has some flaws, but it's an interesting game. I think the thing about the game that really shines, in my opinion, is the setting and the theme, and the actual mechanics and whatnot, unfortunately, are a little bit lacking. And it lacks a little bit of the heart of some other games like it, but the theme and the setting are pretty interesting, so that's what we're playing today. But we're not actually going to be talking about the gameplay in front of you, so you're going to see me moving through an operation and kind of shooting and killing and maybe dying a little bit. But the purpose of this video is not to talk about Phantom Doctrine, it's to talk about my impressions of the new Jack Ryan series out on Amazon Prime. As some of you probably already know, I think it was last Friday, the Amazon Prime released a new exclusive for Prime series. So members of Amazon Prime are able to kind of get their own Netflix-like experience. And Amazon has several shows on there. Man in the High Castle is kind of one of the really well-known shows on there, and there's a few other as well. But a new one which just came out is a reboot of the famous Jack Ryan character. Those of you who may know, in the 1980s, there was a book that came out called, I think it was Clear and Present Danger was the first one, and then Patriot Games shortly thereafter, or maybe it was The Hunt for Red October. I always get the three confused. But in any event, the Jack Ryan series started in the 1980s. It was written by Tom Clancy, and it followed a CIA operative named Jack Ryan through a series of largely improbable but interesting techno-thrillers, and was really one of the premier series of techno-thriller books. In my opinion, the Sum of All Fears, the book, not the movie, is still one of the best stories from a sort of Cold War sort of scenario spy thriller that I've ever really read. And I think it's, the Tom Clancy books can be a bit of a slog. They can be a little bit long, or at least the originals could be, but yet they were tremendously good in some cases, and in others not so much. But with that being said, that spawned a long series of books that's actually still ongoing after Tom Clancy's death, and multiple movies. So Alec Baldwin played Jack Ryan in The Hunt for Red October. You had Harrison Ford in Patriot Games in Clear and Present Danger. You had Alec Baldwin in The Sum of All Fears. And most recently there was some, I never saw the most recent one, but Chris Pine played Jack Ryan in some sort of origin story movie taking place in modern times. The interesting thing with the Jack Ryan books is, given their length and their sort of heft and their slow development in many cases, they always seemed ideally suited for a TV series. Certainly more so the Tom Clancy book, The Sum of All Fears, which does not feature Jack Ryan. But a lot of these books, there's a lot of moving pieces, there's a lot of characters, there's a lot going on. And so they always felt like they'd make more sense as a TV series, and yet that never really developed. Again, you had a couple of movies, but there was never really an attempt to turn these books into a TV series, and these were tremendously successful books. Again, this is a book series that's been going on for over 30 years and is still going on strong. So don't, even after the author's death, they still have sort of ghost authors that are writing follow-ons to the series. And, that's a testament to the strength of the franchise. And so Amazon purchased rights to be able to produce a TV series, and this is their effort. Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan, the lead character of the lead actor of Jack Ryan is John Krasinski. I might be pronouncing that wrong. He is the actor who played in A Quiet Place. He also played in 13 Hours, and probably you all know him from the TV series The Office, where he played as Jim Halpert for, what was it, like 7 or 8 years on network television in a tremendously successful comedy series. And so the series is 8 episodes long. Just went onto Amazon Prime last Friday. And it follows Jack Ryan's character from being sort of a low-level analyst in the terrorist and finance department or whatever, basically a financial bureau of the CIA, through to becoming basically, if not really formally a field agent, he's still technically an analyst, but sort of from being a guy who's just in a cubicle in the office every day to a guy who at the end of every episode, within the last 10 minutes or so, is generally engaged in a firefight of some sort. You can almost set your watch to it. The last 10 minutes is when you've got a really well-produced action scene, and the first 50 minutes are all kind of racing toward that conclusion. Overall, it's to me it was a compelling series, and I know it's been met with some mixed reviews from critics out there. Most of the people I've talked to seem to enjoy it. It has its flaws. Jack Ryan's character is a little bit bland, to say the least. I think the most interesting thing about him, the series throughout all 8 episodes pretty much tries to play up this helicopter crash which knocked him out of the Marines and occurred when he was in Afghanistan. So those of you who are familiar with the book, Jack Ryan's character had been a Marine. I believe he was a lieutenant or something along those lines, and very early in his Marine career there was a helicopter crash. He was badly injured his back, could no longer be a Marine, and that's sort of, I believe, when he went into teaching. He ended up getting a PhD, I think it was in history, and becoming a professor at Annapolis, I believe it was, in the books. In this series, it takes a little bit of a divergent look. So he's a Marine. He's injured in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. You find more and more out about that crash as the series progresses. And afterwards, he joins, it seems like, he goes into Wall Street for a little bit, which also occurred in the books. He gets a PhD in economics, and then he joins the CIA. This is taking a look at the character when he's still in the CIA at the low level as an analyst, and in this, he's tracking down this terrorist, and this terrorist that becomes the protagonist is actually the person you see in the very first scene of the show. As a child in 1983, this character named Suleiman is living in Libya as a child and is presumably injured in a bombing raid on his village. So you have sort of this happy-go-lucky childhood, all of a sudden interrupted by a bombing raid, presumably by the Israelis. It occurs in 1983. You just sort of see these jets streak across the sky, and then they come in, and the village is engulfed in flames. Spoiler alert, but that's like 30 seconds into the show, so you'll get that. And that sort of leads him down this, well, you would think it leads him down this path toward becoming a terrorist, although it's a little bit more complicated than that. You find out more about the character's backstory as well as the series progresses. So that's sort of the two main protagonists. You have Jack Ryan, sort of Boy Scout American, almost flawless character. Somehow he's good at everything right away. They try and portray him as being a little bit of not a little bit, but more or less like a stat nerd. They're trying to say like, oh, he's an analyst, he's all into numbers and stats, and they have this, in the second episode, there's this really weird, awkward sort of fantasy sports dialogue, which I think is just, to me, it's like they wrote it about what they think a sports nut who's a stat head would talk about a fantasy conversation. And I'm pretty into sports, and I'm pretty into advanced analytics, and I played fantasy sports. I know a lot of people who play fantasy sports. I have never once heard a conversation about fantasy sports evolve in the way that conversation does in the second episode. It's painful to listen to. And there's a few spots in this series where the dialogue is painful to listen to. I think, it's easy when I sit down and think about this series and sort of critique the series to say like, oh, there's a lot of negatives, right? Like there's this character who is and one of the things with the Jack Ryan series is you always have these different points of view. So it's never just the protagonist. You're not just following around Jack Ryan. You're not just following around Suleiman. It's more complicated than that. In fact, I think the character who gets even more airtime than Suleiman is his wife. But before I go too far into that, so the series opens at sort of this view of Suleiman and what happens to him as a child. It then goes back and takes a look at Jack Ryan, sort of an everyday analyst at the CIA, as he's beginning to put sort of pieces together about this up-and-coming terrorist named Suleiman. It tries to do so in a way that it makes Jack Ryan out to be a sort of, again, a numbers guy or a nerd or something. I don't think it totally lands there. Again, the dialogue and all of that is pretty weak. The series is better when it's more of an action series than when it's trying to make numbers and stats and things like that sexy, because it doesn't even really delve into that. It's just sort of a really superficial look at what maybe an outsider would think, a stat head would think. And then as you're sort of beginning to be introduced into this Jack Ryan character, you're also introduced to Hanin, who is the wife of Suleiman, the terrorist. So the protagonist, Suleiman the terrorist, is married to Hanin, and she is the mother of 3 of his children. And there's this interesting sort of evolution over the first few episodes of her point of view and sort of what she thinks. And I'm trying not to give away too much in the way of spoilers, but she becomes almost sort of a pseudotypical main character as well, where you have Jack Ryan, which I would say he takes up probably about 30% of the screen time, and then another 30 to 40% are split. Maybe he's 40%, and then another 30 to 40% is split with, I would say, the majority of that going to Hanin, and then a smaller portion of it going to Suleiman, although it kind of depends on the episode. It's a little bit back and forth. And then occasionally there's like an individual subplot. I think one of the most cringeworthy plots in this series, which really adds nothing, it's just out there ludicrous, ridiculous, and stupid, is this drone pilot, this sort of regretful drone pilot based out of Las Vegas, who's obviously having some issues with what he does, and he's a pilot piloting Predator or Reaper drones over Syria, dropping bombs on suspected terrorists, and there's this whole just ridiculous subplot along the side that I think is it literally adds nothing to the series. It makes you cringe. It makes you say, what the fuck was that for? And it only has a very tangential relationship with the actual main plot. Like, it's a split second where it's relevant. And I think they would have been a whole lot better if they just cut that out. There's a lot of problems with the character, with the individuals the character interacts with, and with just the story arc that follows him. It's just a train wreck. The whole series would have been better if that had been shelved. And it's getting some other flack because there was some slurs in the actual dialogue between the characters. But even outside of that, it was just a bad storytelling, bad, lazy, and just unnecessary storytelling, which I'm not really sure what the point of it was. So, like, that was the worst part of the series, was this drone pilot subplot that was just bizarre as fuck. I think you can tell I don't do film reviews often. There's some other characters that you'll recognize from the books. So Kathy Mueller is Jack Ryan's eventual wife in the books anyway. I don't know if it'll transpire that way in the series, but at least in the books, she was a surgeon or a doctor. In this series, she's a doctor as well of communicable diseases or sort of infectious diseases. And her character is there and has actually one or two really brilliant moments where her and Jack are interacting with each other, and I think if I was to sum everything up, and her father's there as well, and in the books he was a jackass, and in this series he was a jackass. Actually, Jack Ryan worked for her father previously when he worked in Wall Street before he went back into government service working for the CIA, and I think they do a good job there. My two main critiques of this series, one was the drone pilot, and the other was just, it feels like everything's really rushed. Again, I'm trying to say my opinions of this series without giving pretty much anything away, because it's only 3 days old, and again, I don't do film reviews, and people don't come to my site for film reviews. I just felt like I would talk about it a little bit. But it feels really rushed. It's 8 episodes. Again, every single episode, it feels like there's an action scene in the last 10 minutes or so, and then you kind of move on to the next episode. But a lot of the dialogue and the interactions just feel forced. especially in the first episode. Everything seems really rushed and forced, and that kind of continues. So Jack and Kathy's relationship, it's hard to get a sense of anything there because everything is so quick and dirty. I think there was really actually quite a bit of potential to try and build off this. Jack Ryan's a CIA agent, and he's not trying not to tell what he's doing, and he's flying over the world, but he's also trying to have a relationship with this person back in the United States. There's a few scenes where you kind of have this tension or difficulty of trying to reconcile the two, but in general it just kind of skips over that and resolves a lot of the issues in a half-hearted way. And I know it's not a rom-com or anything like that. It's not a romantic movie. It's not a romantic drama, anything like that. So to make it front and center of the series would be, would miss the mark. But it also doesn't even really feel like they tried. It kind of feels like they tried to say, like, all right, Jack Ryan's a CIA agent. He's trying to have a relationship. Maybe we can do something with that for 30 seconds, and then we're moving on to something else. And there's no real capitalizing on what potentially... I think could have been a really strong sort of component to humanizing Jack Ryan, the character. And there is sort of a payoff moment in that whole series, and I think it landed pretty damn well for what it was. It would have been even better if it hadn't been sort of rammed down your throat in so little time. In addition to that, again, I think, in my opinion, the series was 8 episodes. It probably should have been 12 to 14. You kind of get the Suleiman character that you're building up, and all of a sudden it's just like the last few episodes, it feels like the character they were trying to portray early in the movies in the series becomes something completely different, as if, a lot of the efforts to sort of make you understand who this person was as an individual is just thrown out the door, and now they're just generic villain going down generic villain activities and firefights and shootouts and things like that. There's some threats that are made that are never even attempted to be followed up on. It's kind of like, I'm gonna find you, but never actually try. Like, again, there's a lot of potential there that I don't think was really attempted to be delivered on. At the end of the day, Jack Ryan's character is kind of bland. They make a bunch of references to him being like a Boy Scout and just too good, a goody two-shoes or whatever, which was always sort of the Jack Ryan character, so that's fitting with the books. But on the flip side of that, like, it would have been nice to feel like he was a human being and understand a little bit more about him. Really, all you get in this series is he crews. You see him rowing his boat. He's super fit. He's super buff. He is in the CIA, and that's about it. And there are moments in the series where they try and modernize things a little bit to be a little bit less gung-ho America, to be like, all right, there's some moral ambiguity with some of these things. There's an interaction with a French agent where, she's kind of asking Jack how he can work for his government, and he's kind of like, well, there's sort of this dialogue of, like, I can affect change more from the inside than the outside. But they just feel like they were tacked on and thrown on, and there was never really any substance behind any of this. And I think that's the biggest complaint with the series, is that, one, it feels a little bit rushed. 8 episodes to me seems a little bit short to try and cover what they're trying to do. It doesn't allow enough time for personal development. It doesn't allow enough time for those side stories to be genuine and having a payoff. It includes this ridiculous subplot of a drone pilot that the whole series would have been better off without. And other than that, because of those two things, because they were using up time on the drone pilot, and because there were only 8 episodes, there wasn't enough time to flesh other things out in a more holistic manner. With that being said, the action scenes were very well done. They were very compelling. The actual plot that the show is trying to develop, you could kind of see coming from a little ways away. There was a little bit of a twist at the end that I think was interesting, and I think a lot of reviewers missed that. But on the whole, it was relatively predictable, especially within a given episode. You could really see where things were going. I do think there were a few interesting twists. One around, I don't want to give too much away, but the helicopter crash had an interesting component to it that sort of had Jack Ryan's backstory that I think is compelling. Probably I would have put it a little bit further forward in the series, but it's compelling. And then the actual terroristic plot has an interesting little sub-twist at the end. You saw the main piece coming, but there was a little bit of a twist at the end that I don't know how many people caught on. It certainly was obvious if you were watching, but it wasn't something that I saw a lot of reviewers comment on. Overall, though, it was entertaining television. And, you know, I've seen some complaints that, oh my God, the character's, he's so conservative, he's so rah-rah America, there's no moral ambiguity. And while there were things there that I think they could have done better on, let's face it, that's who Jack Ryan, the character, is. Jack Ryan, the character, is never going to be a gray man or a Bourne identity, Jason Bourne type character fighting against the system. He's always going to be sort of G.I. Joe in a spy suit. And that's just sort of what the character is. And if you accept that as that being the character, and you don't accept that as necessarily this is the way politically it needs to be, I think it's an interesting divergence. It's an interesting sort of action thriller show that, you know, you can just kind of sit back and enjoy. And I wouldn't put it much deeper than that, because I don't think it is much deeper than that. I wouldn't say that the political statements the show is trying to make are, if there even are any, are really much of something to think about. But I think there were things that could have been done to make it more interesting. At the end of the day, though, the action scenes were well done. The firefights were compelling. The storyline was actually, I think, pretty well thought out and pretty well done. The backstory was reasonably compelling, and I think tells you a little bit about who these characters were. There was at least an attempt to humanize the protagonist a little bit in a way that I don't think is often done in these kind of movies, and I don't think is getting any credit. And it's just entertaining sort of television. I mean, who was it? Was it Michael Bay was actually involved, which is kind of, I think you can tell, and wasn't necessarily, I don't think it was too bad, but overall it was just sort of one of those, all right, is it a great TV show? No. Are there a lot of things that probably should have been done differently or done better? Yes. But if I had to say, you know, I've always, maybe, I don't know if it's guilty pleasure, but I've always enjoyed the Jack Ryan character. And despite the fact that I have had serious reservations with a lot of the books and a lot of the plots behind them and just the ludicrous way that things develop, it still is sort of a guilty pleasure of mine, and I've always enjoyed them, and I think this does a lot. The other thing I will say is the Jim Greer character, Admiral Greer, who would become Jack Ryan's boss and was Jack Ryan's boss in this, is a very different character than he was in the series, the TV series. I could see, or in the movies or the books, I could see some diehard Tom Clancy supporters having some issue with it. You know, for one, he's no longer an admiral, but I think his character's actually pretty interesting. And one of the things that I really liked, and it almost reminded me a little bit of like the Hornblower-esque of the miniseries of Horatio Hornblower, was in the first 1 to 2 episodes of the series, they did a really good job of, I think, sort of showing a divergence in the CIA between the 7th floor and the grunts on the ground, if you will. And you see the 7th floor, these offices, these administrators, this sort of political structure of the CIA jockeying for power. And then you see just sort of the ordinary grunts at the grind wheel. The massive bureaucracy of the CIA is somewhat hinted at, and the political machinations is somewhat hinted at. And I guess if there was one thing I was a little disappointed at, I thought it was really well done in the first 2 episodes to show that political struggle between Jim Greer and sort of his superiors, and also even sort of trying to pull in Jack Ryan. And I don't think they really, I feel like they kind of left that there. And again, I think that's one of those things where if the series was a little bit longer, they could have delved more into those sort of interesting subplots. But Jim Greer is a admiral in the books, and he's actually a CIA operative. He was he had his star was fallen. He was given this post as Jack Ryan's boss at the head of this finance division as sort of a backwater from where he had been. He has a falling out in his career due to an incident that you find out more about in the series. But I think that was interestingly done. I think Greer's character is a little bit less one-dimensional than he was in some of the books. And I think it's compelling, and I think it's interesting, and it's different. I think some fans of the series won't like it, but I do think it's well done and interesting. And I wish that they had taken the first 2 episodes where they really do focus a little bit more on the politics of the CIA, and they had played that up a little bit more. Now, the series has already been renewed for Season 2. They're actually have already said that Season 2 will focus on South America. So the first series was generic, Muslim bad guys. Okay, we get that in pretty much every rah-rah spy thriller. The interesting thing, it was never one of the really big tenets of the Jack Ryan books. It was in some of them, but it certainly wasn't the only villain. Russia frequents far more often, given the times the books were written in. But this book will be, or this series, Season 2, will be focusing on South America. So that will be interesting to see how that plays out. I feel like this is more of me rambling about my thoughts of the series than anything else. Suffice to say, I have some serious reservations with the series, but at the end of the day, for 8 hours, I enjoyed it. And as a fan of the Jack Ryan series, it was something that I'm looking forward to Season 2 to see what they do. I hope there's less cringeworthiness. I hope the characters start to actually evolve into more human-type characters. I hope they play up the political element of the CIA. I think if they're going to focus on South America, then that would be an even bigger opportunity to sort of show the internal machinations and politics of the CIA. And I think, that certainly, if you're looking at Clear and Present Danger, Patriot Games, was it? Which one was it? Oh, goodness, I'm getting them all confused. Clear and Present Danger. That was the one that focused on drug cartels in Colombia. So if they're doing Season 2 in South America, then to me, I think they're probably going to be taking some of the components from Clear and Present Danger and bringing that into a more modern time setting. So that, I think, is encouraging, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. One other call-out, John Clark's character of the series is not in the TV series. There is a sort of stand-in for him named Matisse. He's basically John Clark, but with a different name. My understanding is there was some conflict over the rights, which I don't quite understand. If they had the rights to Jack Ryan and Tom Clancy, I don't know how they didn't have the rights to John Clark, but whatever. But anyway, so Season 2 will focus on South America. I think there is an even better opportunity to show the politics, the machinations. I hope they develop the characters more. I hope they make Jack Ryan's character more than just this perfectionist Boy Scout, although, again, to be fair, that's kind of what he was in all the books. So, I wouldn't put too much faith there. But all in all, an enjoyable series, not a deep, philosophical, intellectual series, but an enjoyable series despite some of the cringeworthy moments. Let me know your guys' thoughts. I guess the point of this video is more to say, like, hey, what were my thoughts? But I'm curious what all of you think about the series, if this was something that you enjoyed, if it was something that you didn't, if the critiques that I had matched up with your own, or what have you. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it there, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Until next time, though, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you once again for watching, and I'm out.